And to reply to the budget, I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The coronavirus outbreak is an emergency, and so I want to make it clear that we have to work together, all of us, to meet this head-on and to overcome it. But we'll only overcome this virus because of the dedication of our NHS staff, carers and public servants. The steps the government has announced today to head off the economic impact of the coronavirus are obviously welcome, but I have some points I wish to raise. We have to be straight with people. It is going to be much tougher because of the last 10 years of deeply damaging and counterproductive cuts to all of our essential public services. We're going into this crisis with our public services on their knees. And as today's figures confirm, with a fundamentally weak economy, which is now flatlining, with zero growth even before the impact of coronavirus. Today's budget was billed as a turning point, a chance to deliver, in particular on the promises made to working-class communities during the general election. But it doesn't come close. The government's boast of the biggest investment since the 1950s is, frankly, a sleight of hand. It's in fact only the biggest since they began their slash-and-burn assault on our services, economic infrastructure and living standards in 2010. And having ruthlessly forced down the living standards and life chances of millions of our people for a decade, the talk of levelling up is a cruel joke. The reality is that this is a budget which has an admission of failure, an admission that austerity has been a failed experiment. It didn't solve our economic problems, but made them worse, that held back our own recovery and failed even in its own terms. And today's measures go nowhere near reversing the damage that has been done to our country. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish the honourable member for Mid-Bedfordshire well. Many people are understandably very worried about the impact of coronavirus on their own lives. The government needs to be very clear what it is announcing, and there are still questions to be answered about the government's response. What coverage is there for people on 0 hours contracts or those without a contract of employment beyond reforms to benefits? Will statutory sick pay adjustments announced today be available to all workers from day one? What support will be made available for low-paid workers who don't meet the lower earnings limit for statutory sick pay? Are there any plans to increase the level of statutory sick pay, which itself is actually scandalously low? Will people who are doing the right thing by self-isolating continue to be punished with a 5-week wait for universal credit payments? The benefit system can't be only to support for millions of workers not entitled to statutory sick pay. The crisis is exposing the vulnerabilities in our economy and our public services. When 17,000 National Health Service beds have been cut, leaving 94% of the remaining beds full, when 100,000 people were forced to wait more than 4 hours on trolleys in A&E departments in January, it's little wonder people worry that the extra money for the health service is too little, too late. We only have a quarter of the intensive care beds per person that Germany has. We don't have enough ventilators to deal with a mass outbreak or the people with the necessary trained skills to operate those ventilators. Across the National Health Service, there are at this moment 100,000 staff vacancies. And moreover, public health budgets have been slashed by £1 billion in recent years. What an irony. Public health is based on the principle that prevention is better than cure. But this government is providing money only after a serious outbreak is underway. We know that the most vulnerable people to coronavirus are older people. That is when we need a strong social care system. But social care is in crisis. There's an £8 billion funding gap since 2010. Instead of the government presenting a social care plan, which the part-time Prime Minister told us was ready long ago, they're asking the rest of us to come up with ideas. Underpaid care workers, a quarter of them, on 0 hours contracts, travel from house to house to provide care to elderly and sick people. It's a model that could scarcely be better designed to encourage the spread of a virus. So it is vital that the government doesn't wait a few months but comes up now with answers to ensure that care workers do not lose out for staying away from work if they experience the symptoms. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor shows a lot of brass neck when he boasts that measures to deal with coronavirus are only possible because of his party's management of the economy. Look outside. In the rest of the world, in the real world, we're still living through the slowest economic recovery in a century. Our economy is fundamentally weak. ONS figures out today show the economy is not growing. Growth was 0.0% in the 3 months to January. 0.0% in the 3 months to the end of January. The Prime Minister might find this funny. Those struggling don't. Future growth has been downgraded yet again, from 1.4% to 1.1% this year, and that is before coronavirus has been taken into account. We have stalling productivity, flatlining business investment, and wages of only just scraped past pre-crisis levels. None of this can be blamed on coronavirus, and it isn't all because of Brexit either. It's because they have failed on the economy. That failure has left us the most regionally unequal country in Europe. Investment spending per head in London is currently more than double that of the East Midlands. And now they talk about levelling up. But who pushed huge swathes of our country so low in the first place? It's Conservative governments that have starved the country of investment over the last 10 years, resulting in a £192 billion hole in infrastructure spending. What has that meant for people? It's meant bus services have been cut. There is patchy access to broadband. Homes and businesses ruined because of inadequate flood defences. The Chancellor expects plaudits for half-filling the investment hole his party created in the first place. Amid a blizzard of hype, he's claiming today marks the biggest capital injection since the 1950s. But, Mr. Speaker, this is actually all smoke and mirrors. As a percentage of GDP, it only returns us to the levels we had before the Conservatives slashed investment so drastically in 2010. Given the challenge of the coronavirus crisis, we need a far-reaching reaction to strengthen and stabilise our economy and ensure we are in the strongest position possible to navigate the transition to new relationships with the EU and a post-Brexit economy and the trade deals that will enable that to happen. If the government truly wanted to level up after Brexit, there is only one thing they should be doing above all else: a green industrial revolution. They would have a plan to kickstart new green industries and create skilled jobs all across our country. The climate emergency threatens our very existence. It demands we mobilise our resources on a massive scale. The environmental measures announced by the Chancellor today get nowhere near that. The government has maintained the freeze on fuel duty without lowering bus and rail fares, showing complacency about the climate emergency. Young people especially will be dismayed at the lack of urgency to reduce our emissions. They rightly see this as the Conservatives once again putting the profits of big polluters and oil companies above people's safety and well-being. And when the Chancellor announced with such aplomb a huge investment in road building across the country, where is the environmental impact assessment being made of that policy, or the increased pollution that will come from increased car use and traffic across this country? Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, today's budget confirms that austerity has not worked, even in its own terms. We've had a decade of decline. Austerity has cost the UK economy almost £100 billion, according to the New Economics Foundation. But the true cost is incalculable. I want to give the House an example to bring that home. Errol Graham was an amateur footballer when he was young. By his mid-50s, suffering from mental health issues, he had become reclusive, unable to leave his flat in Nottingham, terrified of the world outside. He couldn't attend his fitness for work assessment, so, because of the government's harsh and very uncaring attitude, his benefits were cut off. With no income for food, he obviously began to go hungry. He wrote a desperate letter to his DWP assessor. "Judge me fairly," he wrote. "It's not nice living this way." Errol weighed 4.5 stone when the bailiffs found his body inside his flat. He had starved to death in this, the 5th richest country in the world. When the Chancellor talks about difficult decisions the government took in imposing austerity, is he thinking of decisions to deprive Errol of his income, or people like Errol who are going through such traumas in their life? And the worst thing is, austerity, all of this suffering, has been a political choice, not an economic necessity. The party opposite continues to make the absurd claim that austerity was needed because spending on schools, hospitals and public services by Labour somehow was the cause of the worldwide financial crash in 2008. A US Senate report into the root causes of the crash singled out two investment banks to blame: Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank. A few weeks ago, the Prime Minister turfed out one Chancellor who had previously worked at Deutsche Bank and replaced him with another one who worked at Goldman Sachs. Truly a government of the people. Now, Mr. Speaker, they want us to believe that austerity is over. But it's not true. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it would take at least £54 billion of current spending this year, excluding health and social care, to get us back to 2010 levels. We've heard nothing even approaching that scale from the Chancellor today. Without it, the IFS says austerity is baked into our economy. And try telling local councils, which face a further £8 billion black hole over this Parliament, that austerity is over. Mr. Speaker, to truly end austerity and fund urgent action on the climate emergency and our public services, we need a fair taxation system. That means making the richest pay their share. But the government's changes to the national insurance threshold will actually mostly benefit higher earners, while those on lower incomes would be far better supported by boosting wages and real social security. The income of the poorest fifth of families has fallen by 7% in just 2 years. And as the Resolution Foundation has said, this has been driven by policy choices. How can it be right that 12 years after the bankers crashed the economy, the poorest 20% of the population are still being made to pay for it, while those at the top are being rewarded yet again? And today we learn they won't even scrap Entrepreneurs' Relief, a huge subsidy mainly benefiting 5,000 people who make an average of £350,000 per year. I can only assume those who fund the Conservative Party have had a quiet word with the Chancellor and told him to back off. Creating a fair taxation system also means tackling tax avoidance and evasion. How can we have confidence in this Chancellor to clamp down on tax dodgers when he previously worked for hedge funds that used the Cayman Islands and had a very close business associate who engaged in a multi-million-pound tax avoidance scheme? And how can we have confidence when the government's big idea is apparently free ports, tax-free zones to allow the super-rich to dodge taxes and take away workers' protections? Mr. Speaker, the last Chancellor resigned, saying that no self-respecting minister could accept being controlled by advisers in Number 10. The new Chancellor accepted that control and now he's presented a budget just 27 days after taking the job. So can I, through him and the chuntering Prime Minister, pass on our congratulations to Dominic Cummings on writing a budget so quickly? But what a letdown it's been. When I first responded to a budget, austerity was very much in the vogue, and our demands for investment and spending were dismissed. The terrain of public debate has shifted dramatically in just a few years, but there's a gaping chasm between the rhetoric of the Conservative Party have adopted and the reality of what they delivered. Because the Conservative Party, whatever they say, will never stand up for working-class communities. They will always, always put the interests of their wealthy friends first. The reality of today's announcements will become clear, and the hard sell and the spin will fade away, and this budget will then be seen to be a lost opportunity, a failure of ambition and a bitter disappointment to all those people who had been promised so much. But from what we've heard today, they're actually going to see very, very little.
Order.